So we're continuing on in our first unit this week by looking at another metaphysical view, another view about what all this stuff is, how it works, how it got here, etc. So far, we've looked at Locke and Descartes. Locke and Descartes were both dualists who thought that, well, there are basically two fundamental substances that make up everything in the universe. Matter, physical stuff like tables, chairs, bodies, lights, computers, and mind, or mental stuff. So they would argue that there is a distinction between our mind and our body, or our mind and our brain, and neither is reducible to one another. They are both differences in kind. They are different things. Locke and Descartes also had something to say about how we obtain knowledge. Metaphysical knowledge, knowledge of other aspects of the universe that we're living in. Descartes was a rationalist. He thought that we obtain knowledge primarily of reality through our minds, through logic and reasoning and critical analysis. Whereas Locke was an empiricist. Empiricism, if you remember, is the view that it's not so much through critical thinking and logical analysis that we obtain knowledge of all this stuff, but through experience, right? Through sensation, through what we see, smell, touch, taste, and hear, and through reflection, we can also form new ideas. That is another experience that we can engage in to cultivate more knowledge. Well, we're looking at a thinker today who's going to agree with Locke as far as empiricism goes. He's going to be like, yeah, we obtain knowledge of the universe around us through experience. But he doesn't think Locke goes far enough. And, as we'll see, he's going to present a different view of what all this stuff is made of and how it works. A monistic view. But we'll get there here in a few moments. So today we're looking at George Berkeley. Berkeley was an Irish bishop of the Anglican Church, writer, thinker, philosopher. And he's somebody who was one of the first thinkers to be critical of the Enlightenment. Now, we've been talking about the Enlightenment a lot in this first unit. Let's just recap that. The Enlightenment was a period in European history, you could also call it a movement, that thought that, look, if we're going to understand all this stuff, we need to be applying our reason and the scientific method. We can obtain knowledge of the universe by exploring it in that way, no longer taking things just on the basis of faith, but actually investigating it for ourselves. And so we characterized it as a period in which these thinkers were trying to unshackle themselves from merely accepting tradition and dogma and faith as a basis for moving and acting within the world, and instead we're relying on some sort of autonomous reasoning and critical thinking capacities. Not everybody felt this same way, okay? Berkeley was one of them. He's one of the first, what we might call, romantic figures who wrote in response to some of these dispositions to be logical and rational and to engage with the world scientifically. Okay? Not that he wanted to leave science behind or leave reason behind entirely, but one of the things that he talked about in his works is that being logical and rational is not the be-all, end-all of human life. See, Berkeley is a part of a movement, a reaction to the Enlightenment that was known as Romanticism. The Romantics thought that while logic and science and reason is good, there's a time and place for it. Okay? There are other things that are incredibly important and add meaning and value to human life, such as the arts, humanities, literature, music, passion, and feeling. It's that kind of stuff that makes life worth living. Those are the things that we should learn about and lean into, not just trying to view the world through this detached, objective lens in which we're trying to cultivate objective knowledge of things, acting like a cold, calculating machine. No, there's more to life than that. And Berkeley sought to support that view, that romantic view, in his philosophy. So while he's going to use reason and logical analysis in the work that we're looking at today, he doesn't think that that is the most important thing in human life. Because as we'll see, he has a deep faith and a commitment to things that might not be completely scientifically and logically expressible. Okay? One of the views that became popular during this time, due to the scientific revolution which preceded the Enlightenment and then the Enlightenment itself, was this mechanistic view of the world. It is still with us today. Basically, during this time, thinkers gravitated towards this idea that you can kind of view the universe as one giant machine or clockwork mechanism, where all of these gears are connected together and things operate according to rational and scientific laws of nature. Because a lot of the people during this time were also Christian, they had a particular conception of God as well. Basically, they viewed God as kind of this grand watchmaker, if we could use that analogy. If the universe is like a watch or a clock, God is the one who created it, wound it up, and set it loose. And now the clock is just ticking and he's just watching it unfold. Not really intervening in things, just letting them go their own way according to the natural laws and operations of the universe, which he set up. Berkeley did not like this view. Okay? He did not gravitate toward this mechanistic understanding of reality, and he did not like how this conception of God seemed to reduce God to some passive observer of what's going on this planet, on this earth. In some sense, you could argue that he probably felt that understanding of reality and that view of God is contradictory with the Christian message, where its central idea has to do with the incarnation of God in the form of Jesus on earth, intervening in things and doing things for humans, providing us salvation. So what we see in this piece and what we see in his other works of philosophy are critiques of these views, which were becoming popular during this time. Okay? Now, what's very interesting about Berkeley is in some parts of his philosophy, he's going to agree strongly with Locke. But the piece that we're looking at today is actually very critical of some of the fundamental Lockean ideas that we explored in our second lecture. Berkeley agrees with Locke that empiricism is right, that's the way to go. But he doesn't think that Locke really takes it to its logical conclusions. That's what he's going to try to do in this piece. And as we'll see, a very strange conclusion emerges if you accept all of the presuppositions and the implications of what empiricism has to say. So, I want to say one more thing before we get into that. The view that we're going to be looking at might seem crazy to you. It might seem insane. But if you're following the logic of it, in some way it makes a lot of sense. And I would caution you against just dismissing anything that we talk about in this class because you have an emotional reaction to it, because it comes off to you as crazy and weird or woo-woo when you first experience it or encounter it. Actually think about what these thinkers have to say, the kind of problems that they're wrestling with. Because if you can maintain an open mind and, pursue truth where it leads, I think you're going to be a lot better off. And you're going to have a better chance at succeeding in not only understanding this stuff, but modifying your own beliefs and hopefully becoming a better person as a result. Okay, so does anybody have any questions so far? Just setting things up here. Okay, well, let's now jump into what Berkeley has to say in this brief excerpt I had you read. Berkeley's doing a lot of things. He's making a lot of arguments in this piece. We're not going to go through them all. We're just going to touch on the ones that I think are most important relative to some of the main ideas we've been looking at in the last few classes. The first thing that we need to discuss is the picture that we looked at that Locke provided us. What I described as this commonsensical picture of reality. What was the kind of picture that Locke offered us? Well, it was something like this. We have a mind. We exist within a body. But outside of our own minds, there are all these objects in the world, right, that have their own independent existences. This table is not going to disappear from reality if you close your eyes. It's still going to be there. It has its own existence. Same thing with any other object, right? All the stuff in your dorm room is still there, even though you're not looking at it. It has its own existence. So there are objects outside of our own minds, independent of our perceptions of them. These objects cause us to have certain ideas. Ideas that Locke thinks we can generally trust are representative of the reality outside of our own heads. So there is some sort of objective way the world is. The objects in the world produce ideas in us that are representations of that external reality. And we can come to know what the stuff is outside of our own minds by experiencing them, reflecting on our own ideas of those things. Berkeley is going to disagree with this common sense picture. And he's got some very interesting and I think compelling reasons for doing so. Recall one of the distinctions that Locke made in his piece between primary and secondary qualities. Do you all remember this distinction? He defined a quality as a power of an object to produce a sensation in us. What was this distinction between primary and secondary qualities trying to get at? Yeah.
Primary was qualities that are inherent in the object, and secondary is like the sensation or idea or
Right, exactly. So Locke had this idea that, look, we have ideas of things, and one of the reasons that we have certain ideas of what an object is like is because that's what the object is literally like. Like, look, when we look at this table, we see one table here. Why? Well, because there's one table here. The oneness is a part of the object. It's an inherent property of the object. Or the shape is an inherent property of the object. Or its mass, or its velocity, and things like that. So some ideas that we have are because that is what the object is like in reality. But then some ideas we have, they're not representative of what the object is like in itself. For example, color, right? Or what something tastes like to you, or sounds like to you. Locke would associate those kinds of ideas with secondary qualities. When you look at this table, you see beige, or whatever that is. But the beige is not a part of the table, like its mass is, or like its shape or its number is, or whether or not it is in motion. Similarly, the taste of a thing is not a part of the object itself. One piece of evidence we could use to support this is things taste differently to all of us, right? Some people like cilantro, some people hate cilantro. Some people like the new carne asada from Chipotle, some people don't like it. If the taste was really a part of that steak, wouldn't we all taste it the same? So Locke has this idea that objects have certain properties, objective properties. Those properties give rise to the ideas in our own minds. And we can distinguish, he thinks, between those ideas that are caused by the properties of the object itself and those ideas that are just caused kind of from our relationship to it, that are informed by our own mood, our own outlook, our own beliefs, all that stuff. Well, Berkeley's going to attack this distinction. He doesn't think this distinction is tenable. He doesn't think that we can know, if we follow empiricism, that, well, there are objects and properties inherent to the object itself that produce some ideas and other ideas in our minds. This distinction, he thinks, is not one that you can actually support. The reason for this is kind of subtle, but extremely powerful. Notice what empiricism says. We obtain knowledge of the world around us through our senses, through our experience. What that means is our window into reality is basically constituted by our ideas that we gain through experience. We talk as if we can know what things are like in and of themselves. But let me ask you this. Do you have access to anything besides your own perceptions? Berkeley would say no. All you have access to are your ideas of things. That is how we see and view reality. That's how our mind represents reality to us. We cannot step outside of our own minds and objectively ascertain what reality is like. All you have access to right now are your perceptions. The sound that you're hearing of the wind moving through the vents, the sensation of you sitting on the chair, the sensation of the hardness of the table. You have all these perceptions, but that's all you have access to. So we can't really prove, we can't really justify that there is a distinction here between primary and secondary qualities. Because the way that everything appears to us is relative to the perceiver. For example, if you look at the shape of this table, Locke would say this shape is inherent to the object itself. Well, if you're looking at it from the top down, it looks like a rectangle, this big. But if you have a different perspective and you look at it like this, it's a much skinnier rectangle, right? Same thing with motion. Locke would say whether or not the object is moving is a property of the object itself. But what does science tell us? Motion is relative to your frame of reference. If you're moving at the speed of light, everything is going to appear as if it's standing still to you. If you and I are walking side by side, and we're just looking at each other and completely focusing on each other, we're both going to appear motionless with respect to each other if we're walking at the same speed. Similarly, when we look at something and we're like, oh, there's one table there, two chairs there, that's also relative to where you're looking at it from, what your mind is like, etc. If you're drunk, maybe you'll see 4 chairs here, right? Or hallucinating, maybe you'll just see 1 chair. So all we have access to is our perceptions of things. And our perceptions are informed by where we're standing, our frame of reference, what our mind is like, all of these things. We cannot prove that there are primary and secondary qualities. That's not something that we can demonstrate because all we have access to are our subjective perceptions of things. That's what Berkeley thinks follows if you take empiricism to its logical conclusion. Locke is talking and arguing and acting as if we can have objective knowledge of what things are like out there outside of our own minds. But our minds is what all of that gets filtered through in how we understand reality. We can't step outside of it. You are stuck kind of in your own unique perspective. You can change it a little bit, but you can't see the world through the eyes of another literally. Right? You're living in your body. You have your dispositions and your mental states. So we might say then, if we wanted to push this even further, the idea that we could cultivate some sort of purely objective knowledge of things and view of things is an impossibility. Because all we have access to are our own perceptions. We take it as a matter of faith, you could say, that our ideas actually represent what's out there. And then what do? Well, if you're raised in a Western society that is very scientific and logical and rational, you're going to be inculcated into the view that there are objects outside of your own minds with their own independent existences, and we can know what those things are like. And that stuff out there is made of a different kind of thing than what my mind is made of. This thing called matter, right? Berkeley is going to have a lot of problems. He's going to raise a lot of issues for that view. To think that there are objects that have their own independent existence, their own existence outside of your own perception, is not something that we can demonstrate. In this piece, he brings up this famous tree thought experiment in order to show something very interesting about the nature of existence and our ideas or perceptions of things. I want us all to do this together. Everybody close your eyes. Close your eyes, no peeking. Okay, now imagine a tree. Imagine a tree in your mind. Okay, are you imagining it? Got that picture? Okay, open your eyes. Could somebody describe the tree that they saw? What kind of tree did you see? What did it look like?
The one from the Pocahontas movie.
Okay. Oh, so it's been a while since I've seen the movie. Could you describe it more?
It's like huge.
Huge tree. Okay, cool. Brown bark.
Yeah, brown bark.
You saw it from like the side?
Yeah.
So you saw like the trunk going up and then the
Like
leaves.
all the animals around and stuff like that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Did anybody else see anything different? Yeah?
I have like a weeping willow in my backyard at home, so I saw that.
And you were looking at it from the side?
No, like straight on. Like,
Straight on?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's right there in front of you,
Yeah,
and
all
it's...
the like branches are all hanging down, but it has the leaves on it. It's not that
Okay.
green and alive.
Beautiful. Weeping willows are great. Did anybody picture the tree from the top down? like bird's eye view, like you're looking down over it. Sometimes students do that, but it's rare. Notice what you're doing when you're imagining a tree, or you're imagining anything. We could say that you are perceiving it. You might not be perceiving what you think is a real tree out there in reality, but you're perceiving that image of a tree. Well, let's apply that same idea towards objects outside of our own minds. What we think are objects outside of our own minds. Can you imagine an object unperceived? Imagine something in your dorm room right now. Is anybody looking at it? Nobody's in your dorm room, right? Probably. Imagine a stuffed animal that you have on your bed or your pillow. Locke's picture of the world is that there are all these objects outside of our own minds that have their own existences, and their existence is independent of our perception. But what Berkeley tries to show is that that's not something that we can ever demonstrate. We kind of take it as a matter of faith that these things that we call objects exist independently of perception. But that's just a matter of faith. It's impossible to imagine an object unperceived. Why? If you imagine or conceive of something that nobody else is looking at, you're looking at it. Right? Using your mind. Isn't that kind of strange? What Berkeley thinks this shows is this idea that we have of the world, that we're inculcated into, that this table's still going to be here when we leave the room, and this chair has its own existence. That's not something that we can know or demonstrate. Because again, all we have access to are our perceptions. And when we do try to conceive or imagine of an object having its own independent existence, we sneak in a perceiver when we do that. So this idea that existence and perception are separate and have nothing to do with each other is not something that we can prove or show. The basic scientific picture of the world that most of you have and that Locke is relying on is not something that's demonstrable. Berkeley thinks this has some very interesting implications for this scientific worldview that's becoming popular during his time, and the idea of matter making up objects. Try to see if you can, in your own minds, figure out where Berkeley is going to go with this. In the meantime, let's follow him along on this little excursion. He says that neither our thoughts, nor passions, nor ideas formed by the imagination exist without the mind is what every person will allow. So, thoughts, passions, ideas, these things occur in minds. They can't exist anywhere else, anyhow else. And it seems no less evident that the various sensations or ideas imprinted on the sense, however blended or combined together, that is, whatever objects they compose, cannot exist otherwise than in a mind perceiving them. I think an intuitive knowledge may be obtained of this by anyone that shall attend to what is meant by the term exist when applied to sensible things. The table I write on, I say, exists. That is, I see and feel it. And if I were out of my study, I should say it existed. meaning thereby that if I was in my study, I might perceive it, or that some other spirit actually does perceive it. There was an odor. That is, it was smelled. There was a sound. That is to say, it was heard. A color or figure, and it was perceived by sight or touch. This is all that I can understand by these and the like expressions. For as to what is said about the absolute existence of unthinking things, without any relation to their being perceived, that seems perfectly unintelligible. Their essay is percipi, we'll get back to that, nor is it possible that they should have any existence out of the minds or thinking things which perceive them. So when you say things like, this table exists, what are you saying? I see a table. When you say things like, my teddy bear back in my room exists, you're saying, I'm conceiving or imagining my teddy bear. When you're saying, there was a smell in my room, what you're saying is, I smelled something in my room. Right? So, when we talk about the existence of things, we always associate that with our perception. It's impossible to talk about or describe the existence of things without bringing perception along with it. It is indeed an opinion strangely prevailing amongst men that houses, mountains, rivers, and in a word, all sensible objects have an existence natural or real, distinct from their being perceived by the understanding. But with how great an assurance and acquiescence soever this principle may be obtained in the world, yet whoever shall find in his heart to call it in question may, if I mistake not, perceive it to involve a manifest contradiction. For what are the forementioned objects but the things we perceive by sense? And what do we perceive besides our own ideas and sensations? And is it not plainly repugnant that any of these or any combination of them should exist unperceived? Thus, if we thoroughly examine this tenet, it will perhaps be found at bottom to depend on the doctrine of abstract ideas. For can there be a nicer strain of abstraction than to distinguish the existence of sensible objects from their being perceived, so as to conceive them existing unperceived? Lights and colors, heat and cold, extension and figures, in a word, the things we see and feel, what are they but sensations, notions, ideas, or impressions on the sense? And is it possible to separate, even in thought, any of these from perception? No. For my part, I might as easily divide a thing from itself. It's impossible. It doesn't make sense. I may indeed divide in my thoughts or conceive apart from each other those things which perhaps I never perceived by sense so divided. Thus, I imagine the trunk of a human body without the limbs, or conceive the smell of a rose without thinking on the rose itself. So far, I will not deny I can abstract, if that may be properly called abstraction, which extends only to the conceiving separately such objects as it is possible may really exist or be actually perceived asunder. But my conceiving or imagining power does not extend beyond the possibility of real existence or perception. Hence, as it is impossible for me to see or feel anything without an actual sensation of that thing, so it is impossible for me to conceive in my thoughts any sensible thing or object distinct from the sensation or perception of it. So I realize he's writing in a way that we're not used to, and it probably doesn't make sense. But let me try to make it a little bit more accessible to you. We look at the world through the lens of our ideas and perceptions. That is all we have access to. When we talk about a thing existing, what we're really saying is, I'm having a perception of this thing. So, to think that there are objects that exist independently of our perception outside of our own minds, we're making a leap of faith. We can't ever prove such objects exist out there that have their own existences. Why? All we have access to are our ideas, sensations, and perceptions. That's all we have access to. And so, not only does it not make sense to make a distinction between primary and secondary qualities, to believe that all of the stuff that we're perceiving is independent of perception is also a leap of faith. And to think that this stuff is made of matter that we've never tasted or touched or felt, that's also making a certain leap. His view is known as idealism. He says that what it means for something to exist is that it is being perceived. To exist is to be perceived. That's what that term means. And so somehow, the existences of things and our perceptions of them are not separable. We talk as if, this thing would still be here if we're not looking at it, but we can never prove that. And when we talk about objects, what we're talking about are our perceptions of them. Because when you talk about the table, what are you talking about? You're talking about what you see, what you feel, what you taste if you chomp on it, what you smell if you get down and smell it. That's the stuff that we're relying on. That's the stuff that we're invoking when we're talking about objects. We're talking ultimately about ideas when we use words like table, chair, computer, wall, light fixture. We're talking about ideas. Thus, we cannot prove that there are objects out there in the world that exist independently of us. It's not something we could ever demonstrate because all we have access to are the contents of our own minds. What objects are just conjunctions or bundles of perceptions. That's what an object is. It's not something that exists independently of your perception. It is a bundle of perceptions. That's what an object is. And so this leads him to a very strange view. He denies the dualism of Locke and Descartes, this idea that there's matter and then there's mental stuff, and these two different substances make up everything. You know what Berkeley says? We could never prove that. That's not something we can know. Because all we have access to are our own perceptions. All we can know for sure is that consciousness exists. Or mentality. Or mental stuff. And so he puts forth a view known as idealism, sometimes called immaterialism. It's the view that the universe is made up of ideas and minds and nothing else. There's one substance that makes up everything, and that is what you could call consciousness, or mental stuff, mentality, mind. That's it. That's all there is. Does this view sound crazy to anybody else? If it sounds crazy to you, just reflect kind of on what he's saying. Can you ever step outside of your own mind and view reality? Do you have access to anything but your own ideas? Berkeley would say no. You don't. So that leads him to this view, which sounds strange to us because we've grown up in a culture that is kind of dualistically minded, or if anything, it's materialist and says everything is just made of matter. But let me ask you, have you ever seen matter? Have you ever tasted matter? The underlying substance that's supposed to make up all this stuff? Have you ever heard matter? No, if you've never sensed that stuff, why would you believe that it exists? You know you have ideas. You know you have perceptions and feelings. So you can know that consciousness exists. But how could you say anything more than that? How could you prove it? This is what Berkeley is trying to get at. He says that matter is just a mental abstraction. This idea of matter, this underlying substance that makes up all these things that we can't see, that we can't taste, that nobody has ever seen or looked at or tasted, that's just a mental construct. It's a fiction. It's an illusion. It's something these Enlightenment thinkers and thinkers of the scientific revolution are making up and fooling themselves into believing. If we're going to take empiricism seriously, and this is the basis for the scientific method, right? Observation, hypothesis, experiment. Empiricism is the basis of the scientific method. If we take that seriously, we need to dispel from the scientific worldview this idea, this tomfoolery that matter is a thing. Because none of us have ever experienced it. All we experience are our ideas and perceptions. That's it. Berkeley's view is what's called a monistic view. Monism is the view that one substance makes up everything in the universe. For Berkeley, that is mind or consciousness. In contrast to the dualistic view of Descartes and Locke that we've already looked at. And so what Berkeley paints for us is a different picture of reality, a different picture of perception, and a different view of what the relationship is between our ideas and what is outside of our own minds than Locke paints. For Locke, you could say perception is kind of a passive thing. Right? Objects out there cause certain ideas in you. But Berkeley kind of presents a different view of consciousness or perception. Somehow, consciousness or perception is a more active thing than Locke implies. It's not as if ideas or objects cause ideas in us. That doesn't make any sense. Can a table have an idea? Can a rock have a thought? No. If those things can't have ideas or thoughts, how could they produce them in our minds? What's the only thing that can have ideas and thoughts? Consciousness, right? Consciousness has ideas and thoughts and perceptions. So it's consciousness that produces ideas or mind. Objects don't produce ideas in you. Mind or consciousness produces ideas in itself, you could say. He says it is the spirit, mind, soul, or will. He uses these interchangeably, which produce ideas, forms them, and alters them. Now, if you're following along carefully, you should have a question for Berkeley. A few questions, perhaps. So consciousness produces ideas, huh? The perception and the existence of a thing are inseparable, huh? Does that mean if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around to hear it, that it doesn't make a sound? What do you think Berkeley would say?
Maybe that even something like a tree falling would have effects that are so small, but even if they're small, we would notice them in some way.
He's going to say something even crazier. He's going to say if there's no mind around to perceive it, it does not make a sound. There is no sound. And that should lead you to another question. What the hell are you talking about, Berkeley? Consciousness produces ideas. Does that mean my consciousness is constructing my own reality? Does that mean everything that I see is just what my mind is making up? It's just my subjective mind painting a picture for me? How could I ever know anything? Is that how reality works? We're all just seeing our own world and they're all different? No. That's not how reality works. The reality that we see is not a mental construction of our own minds. We do not make up the reality that we see. It is not a fiction produced by our own consciousness. And we just know this through experience, right? When we look at the wall, we all see a similar thing, right? When I do this, we all hear a similar thing, right? You could argue the same thing. The fact that we're able to communicate at all must mean our perceptions are similar, if not the same, right? Because how else would we be able to talk about anything or get anything done? Unless we're all kind of perceiving and interpreting reality in a similar way. So Berkeley doesn't think any of us are making this up, but there is something, or I should say someone, that is holding it all together. Can you guess who that's going to be? Remember, he was a bishop. That's right, the big man upstairs. Our ideas of things are not random. They're not fictions created by our own mind. Because God has created everything. God is the ultimate cause of reality, of our ideas. God has baked into the nature of reality certain rules and laws that govern perception, that make it so you have certain ideas when you look at a certain thing, or have certain perceptions or sensations when you engage with an object. He calls these rules and principles the laws of nature. God created reality according to certain rules and laws, and that explains why we see similar things when we look at the wall. We feel similar sensations when we're getting a massage. We have similar reactions to things. So, if there was no mind to perceive it, the tree falling in the forest would not make a sound. So too, if you have a pet in your room and nobody is there to pet him or see him, you might worry your pet has disappeared, right? Because there's nobody there to perceive your pet. But Berkeley says you don't have to worry about that. Why? God is perceiving everything at all times. God is kind of holding all of the things in existence through His will, through His perception. So you don't have to worry about rocks and mountains and rivers disappearing when you're not going on a hike, because God's watching over it all. He's got the whole world, right, in His hands. You remember that song? No? Nobody go to Sunday school? Historian Darren Staloff says, according to Berkeley's view, you could consider God the ultimate switchboard of ideas. God has His hand in producing the ideas and the sensations that you have, in regulating your perception, in allowing your communication with others and the expression of that information. The reason why we don't all have random perceptions is because God is making it so. Now, I know this sounds crazy and bizarre to you, but Berkeley actually thinks that this idealistic view has less assumptions and presuppositions than the dualist view, than the materialist view that we'll look at here in a bit. In other words, he thinks that this view can make sense out of everything that we need to understand about reality, and it can do it with fewer assumptions, fewer leaps in logic, if any. He thinks it's parsimonious. That's why he gravitates towards it. We don't need to assume matter exists to make sense out of objects. We don't need to say there are two substances that make up things. No, you can just explain it with mind, with consciousness, with God. That's all you need. And so he would say there is an external world. There is a world outside of our own minds. It's just not made of what you thought it was made of. There are tables and chairs. There are rocks and rivers and mountains and trees. Reality is a certain way outside of your own subjective understanding and belief. He's not saying any of this stuff is less real. You're not making up your reality. Okay, there is a table in front of you. I am talking to you. Yellowstone is out there. It's not a fiction. It's just not made of this thing called matter that you thought it was made of. So there is a world outside of your own heads. It's just not made of what you thought it was made of. Thus, we don't need to give up on the idea that there is the way the world is. We don't need to give up on the idea that there are things outside of our own minds. We don't need to give up on the idea that if you close your eyes, you'll still run into the table, because it's there. It really is there. It's just that it's not physical, and God is holding it all together. So, Berkeley presents a very different metaphysical view. His view is idealism. He thinks you can explain all that we need to explain by arguing that, look, it's all just made up of mental stuff or consciousness. You don't need to appeal to matter. Matter is a mental abstraction. You can't prove that matter exists. What his view gets around is a very difficult problem in philosophy. So long as you think there is an external world out there made up of objects with independent existences, you're faced with a problem. How could you ever know what objects are like in themselves if the only way that you can know about them is through your own mind? You have ideas, you have concepts. How could you ever know that those ideas and concepts are reflective of reality if what's out there is fundamentally different than you? If it's made up of a different thing? Berkeley's philosophy gets around this problem because he says it's not made of a different thing. It doesn't have an existence independent of perception. It's made up of the same thing that you're made up of. What's out there is the same thing that's in your mind. In some fundamental metaphysical sense. So we don't have to worry about how do I know what things are like in themselves because all I have are representations of them and that's a completely different thing than me. He's like, no, you don't have to worry about that. That's not a doubt you have to entertain if you hold this view. And so, what his philosophy does, we could say, is bridge the gap between noumena and phenomena. These are fancy words. Noumena, the things in themselves, and phenomena, what appear to you. If you hold a dualistic view, or if you think the stuff out there is made up of something differently than you are made up of, there's always going to be this gap between what exists outside of your own mind and your representations and ideas of that. But his philosophy closes that gap. This is a very difficult problem in philosophy that thinkers have been trying to solve for a very long time. Now, maybe you don't think he solves it. That's fine. You can believe that. But a lot of important thinkers, such as Immanuel Kant, for instance, kind of gave up. Kant is famous for saying you can't know what things are like in themselves out there in the world. We don't have access to that information. So that's not something we could in principle know. But you could look at Berkeley's philosophy as solving that difficult problem. Because he thinks that we don't need to invoke the idea of matter to make sense of anything. It doesn't need to be a part of our worldview. So you could say he uses Occam's razor, which is based around the idea that you don't take on more assumptions than necessary to explain the world. He uses that to cut matter out of the picture. And what I think is a strength of Berkeley's philosophy is that, if not explicitly, implicitly he recognizes the very strong role that consciousness has in shaping our reality. Not just your own subjective reality, but the kinds of societies and world that we live in. Because right now you are surrounded by things that were all at one point just conceptions in the mind. And we constructed them. We made them. So in some real sense, so much of what you interact with on a daily basis is a product of the mind, a product of consciousness. just in a concretized form. Yes? Berkeley recognizes that. Okay, what time do we have? Okay, good. We still have a little bit of time. Now, this is one view that you could have. One particular monistic view of the world that says everything is just made up of the same underlying substance. Berkeley thinks it's mind or consciousness. Now, what are the weaknesses with this view? Well, if you don't believe in God, you're not going to find this convincing. Okay? Maybe you just think this view is so far out of the wheelhouse, it's not even plausible. This view has weaknesses. Okay? There are pros and cons to every view. Let's now contrast this with, I think, what a lot of people in society today believe, which is on the other side of this monistic spectrum. What does the contemporary scientific worldview say about the world? What is everything made of? Matter, right? In the form of atoms and molecules and quarks, electrons, protons, waves, energy, all that stuff. The contemporary scientific view is what we might call materialistic. Not in the sense of buying clothes off Amazon, but materialistic in the sense that matter makes up everything. From stars and supernovas to computers to minds. This is what the majority of scientists believe. They hold what's called a reductive, naturalistic, materialistic view. So let's go through these step by step. First, most scientists today are naturalists. What does that mean? They think everything that exists is a part or product of nature. In other words, there are no supernatural entities. No ghosts, no demons, no God, no angels. Just matter. Or we should say natural stuff. Just things that nature produces. So, that's one part of it. Everything is natural. Everything that exists is a part or product of nature. The other part is materialist. What does materialism say? Well, it's the view that everything fundamentally is made up of matter. So the contemporary scientific view seems to be that everything is natural. What makes up nature? Matter. Natural material. So everything, including your own hopes and dreams, and your own feelings, and your car, and your brother, and your dog, it's all just complex arrangements of atoms and waves. Excitations of various fields, if you want to get physicsy with it. What kind of story does it offer for how all this got here and how it works? Well, it's a very different story than Berkeley's, right? Berkeley would say God created everything, God presides over it. Berkeley probably didn't believe in the theory of evolution. It hadn't come out yet. Probably didn't believe in the Big Bang. But this is what our contemporary scientific view says, right? The Big Bang is responsible for the origins of our universe, including space and time in some fundamental sense. At some point on our planet, life arose and evolved over billions of years into the life forms that we see today through neo-Darwinian natural selection. Those organisms that had the properties, the behaviors, dispositions that were characteristic for survival lived on and reproduced and propagated their genes in the future. And those that couldn't compete with the other organisms, couldn't solve problems in their environment with bad genes, died off. And so what we have today are a bunch of organisms that descended from a common ancestor that evolved over a very long time to be adapted to a particular natural environment. Thus, God doesn't exist, but more importantly, God is not needed to explain any of this. We don't need to invoke the idea of God to talk about how the universe came into existence, how life arose, why we are the way they are, why natural laws work the way they do. We can explain that all with science and the scientific method. Is this a view any one of you are partial to? You like this view? You can raise your hand. Don't be embarrassed. Not going to judge you. This is the view that is prevailing today, right? At least among academics, it would seem, scientists. But this view also has some fundamental philosophical problems, like Berkeley's view, like dualism, like every view that we've looked at so far. If you're just a collection of atoms, is there really a you? How can we make sense of personal identity if you're basically just the same thing as this table, just arranged in a different way? And furthermore, if you're just a collection of atoms or excitations in some sort of field, how could you have control over your own actions? If you think you are just a brain in a body, there are electrical impulses, neuronal firings, biochemical reactions occurring, do you have free will? Or are you just doing what your brain makes you do? This is a very serious problem, right? Because a lot of us believe in free will, but it doesn't seem like it can be justified very well on this view. And then what happens? Say, okay, I'm convinced, Professor Gunner, I no longer believe in free will. What also would you have to give up? Can anybody be morally responsible for anything if nobody has choice? If there aren't genuine alternatives that you can choose from in front of you? How could we hold anybody morally responsible for anything? The serial killer is just a collection of atoms. His brain made him do it. Locking him up is unfair. It's not his fault that he killed and raped those people. Right? If free will goes, it would seem moral responsibility goes as well. And it would also imply certain things about your perception, your experience, your view of yourself. What is love on this view? Well, it's just neuron 34A firing to 44B. That's all love is. What is a hope? What is a dream? Oh, just electrical impulses and biochemical reactions. That's it. The deep betrayal that you feel when your partner cheats on you. Oh, it's just a reaction in the brain. That's it. So it might imply that a lot of the things we think we know about ourselves and the sensations that are associated with those things are not very deep at all. They're not what we think that they are. If you think our existence was a cosmic accident and we are just the products of evolution, that would seem to imply that there is no objective purpose or meaning to your life. Right? You weren't created for a reason. You weren't created at all. You came into existence because your parents had sex at a certain time, and a certain sperm and egg were there and met. This might actually be liberating for you, though. This might not be a downside. Right? There is no objective meaning or purpose. Wouldn't that be freeing? A lot of people find it freeing. It means that they can discover and create their own purpose. They don't have to worry about holding themselves to some sort of transcendental ideal. It would also be difficult, I think, to justify that there is an objective right and wrong. What could ground some sort of objective standard of right and wrong? If all of this is just made of matter, if we're just an amalgamation of atoms and waves, we say things all the time like, you should do this, you ought to do this. Well, what would we really be saying? You should do this because that's what I believe is right. Perhaps. And then what kind of hold should that have on anybody? Great, so you have a certain belief about what is right. Why should I listen to you? I have my own belief. Might lead you to the position of moral relativism, which says that there is no objective standard of right and wrong. It's just relative to the time, place, or culture in which you live. And you might think that there are a bunch of other consequences and implications of holding this view. So, I'm not trying to tell you what to think. What I'm trying to make you aware of is, although Berkeley's philosophy seems crazy, there is no view without its weaknesses. Every view has weaknesses. Every view has strengths. So, if you're interested in trying to come to a better understanding of reality and what the truth is, you got to think about and investigate that stuff. It's critical. Because to hearken back to Plato's cave, if you're just accepting what everybody tells you, well, aren't you just a puppet then, living in a world of illusion? One more thing. Why are we talking about any of this stuff at all? Why does it matter that we talk about how we know things and what makes stuff up? How the world got here? The kinds of creatures or beings we are? Why does any of this matter? What do you think? Anybody have any idea? Why would I be teaching you all this? I love it, but more than that. It's not just for my sake.
To challenge how we view things?
Sure, to get you to think and question this stuff. But more importantly, I want you all to realize that there are things that you believe and care about, and what you believe and care about is informed by all of this stuff. If you think you're just a product of evolution, you're going to have a certain view of morality, a certain view of politics, of how we should organize society. For example, if you're an empiricist, that might lead you to think that we should listen to the lived experiences of people. If you're more of a rationalist, you might think, well, let's do what's rational or logical, as opposed to just listening to people's subjective experiences. If you think the world is just made up of mind, that is also going to inform what your legal, moral, social, and political beliefs are. If you think the world is just made up of matter, that's going to cause you to have different beliefs about how things should be going. So if you really reflect on your beliefs and your worldviews, you'll realize that it's important to study metaphysics and epistemology because everything else is downstream from that in some fundamental sense. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Please sign the attendance sheet if you didn't do that already. And I will see you next week.